Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be talking about the details of two recent fatal night accidents that happened in Florida, both of which should have been avoidable. One occurred in Lantana after a full day of flying after purchasing an aircraft in Kentucky, and the other involved a low-time pilot taking off at night from Venice. Last week in episode 269, we talked with Seth Lake about how to use and how not to use ForeFlight for a successful check ride. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/269. And so that you don't miss next week's episode, in whatever app that you're using to listen to me right now, take a moment and find either the subscribe or the follow key and touch it so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And this is a listener-supported show, so if you've been listening for a while and have learned some new things from the show, I'd like to invite you to become a member and join the club to support Aviation News Talk. For example, listeners who sign up at the $20 a month level can view the many videos that I've posted online in the Patreon users group. Just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And of course, there's a link for that website in our show notes. This week in the news, spare parts are running out for some popular GPS navigators. Civil Air Patrol cadets save a life, and 2 more police helicopters have been fired upon. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, repair parts are running out for the Garmin 430 and 530. Garmin says that those who still rely on its early generation navigational products should start planning a panel upgrade. The company says multiple component availability limitations means the parts needed to fix the devices that herald a revolution in aviation navigation and in-flight information are fading away. Quote, first introduced in 1998, Garmin has offered repair service for the GNS 435 series for 25 years, the company said in a brief service advisory issued March 14th. Garmin plans to continue offering repair service when the components required for specific repair remain available. Database updates and technical support will also remain available. But the company said that starting in 2024, it will no longer be able to fix some issues with the early devices, which include all WAS and non-WAS versions of the GNC 420, GNS 430 and 530, and GPS 400 and 500. The company said now is the time to think about an upgrade. We encourage GNS 430 and 530W owners to begin considering their transition strategy to newer generation products, the advisory said. And this is a big deal. I'm guessing if you've flown in GA aircraft, you've probably flown with a Garmin 430 or 530. It is by far the most popular GPS in history, with more than 100,000 units having been sold. And separately, avionics manufacturer Dynon reports in an email this week that they are now back to their old normal of being able to ship most products from stock. Dynon, like most companies, faced challenges in the past year due to the global supply chain crisis, especially with Skyview HDX displays. They say despite our production team working overtime, limited parts availability, combined with a large and growing demand for their products, resulted in ongoing order backlogs. They say they know it's frustrating to wait for your orders and appreciate your patience and understanding. They also wish to thank their supply chain, production, sales, and engineering teams for working hard to overcome these difficulties and secure the materials and components needed. From NBCnews.com, Sacramento helicopter crash tied to possible theft attempt. Police in California are investigating a helicopter crash that they say happened after a failed theft attempt overnight at the Sacramento Executive Airport. Officers were called to the airport on reports of multiple attempts to break into helicopters between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. Upon arrival, officers found a helicopter that had sustained major damage. No injuries were reported. Police said, quote, nobody is in custody at this time. This investigation is in its early stages and the information is preliminary as detectives work to learn exactly what occurred. The FBI is also investigating. A photographer for NBC affiliate KCRA of Sacramento described the helicopter as totaled after observing it on its side. He said debris littered the tarmac for several yards and it appeared the rotors were smashed. The company that operates the helicopter, Capital Helicopters, said it was severely damaged. Several other helicopters that it operates were also vandalized. And this hits a little bit close to home, as I've seen the Channel 3 helicopter numerous times when I've landed at Sacramento. And actually, I spoke to its pilot one time when we were at the FBO there getting gas. And also, the photo looks very much like the aircraft experienced a dynamic rollover accident, which is what occurs when one of the skids is somehow either still tied down to the ground or is blocked by some object on the ground as the helicopter moves sideways while attempting to take off. From CAP.news, California cadets save elderly choking victim in restaurant. 3 Civil Air Patrol cadets having lunch at Cupertino, California restaurant sprang into action to save a choking elderly woman's life on March the 4th. Cadet Captain Samida Srivatsan, Cadet Second Lieutenant Esme Chen, and Cadet Tech Sergeant Maxim Manakokin, all members of the California Wing's John E. Kramer Composite Squadron 10, which is based at my home airport in Palo Alto, were finishing their meal when one of the waitstaff came to their table to ask if anyone knew the Heimlich maneuver. Because they were seated in a far corner, the cadets were the second to last customers to be asked for help. All 3 immediately rushed over. The choking victim, a 78-year-old, was trapped in a dining booth. Her skin was already cold and pale, and her lips were blue, indicating loss of blood oxygen. She was surrounded by her frantic family, husband, son, and grandchildren. The cadets were shocked at how severe the situation already was. Quote, "I remember thinking, please don't let it be too late. Please don't let this be the day I see someone die," said Srivatsan. Chen, who had completed her American Red Cross First Aid CPR Automated External Defibrillator certification in February as part of CAP's Emergency Services Ground Team training, started to draw on what she learned. She quickly assessed the scene for safety hazard, while Srivatsan dialed 911. The cadets took charge, assuring worried family members that Chen was first aid certified. "We had to get the lady out of the booth first, but she was already unconscious," Manakokin said. They came together as a team to clear the area of tables and lower the woman out of the booth and to the ground. Srivatsan remained on the phone with 911 to provide critical information about the woman's condition and ensure first responders were en route. She and Manakokin also managed the growing crowd and chaos to allow space for Chen to perform back blows and abdominal thrusts. After several sets, the obstruction the woman had choked on was partially dislodged. She started wheezing and was able to breathe again. Within 5 minutes, firefighters and paramedics arrived. The cadets continued to help by calming the shocked grandchildren. After being cleared by paramedics, the women thanked the cadets. She told them she suffered from Parkinson's, putting her at particularly high risk during the incident. Restaurant staff said they were grateful and impressed by the teenagers who stepped up, the only ones among many patrons and staff who knew what to do, and acted calmly and without hesitation. And congratulations to these 3 remarkable teenagers who are part of the CAP cadet program. From flyingmag.com, FAA reduces time allotted for knowledge tests. Applicants slated to take the FAA's private pilot airplane or commercial pilot airplane knowledge exams will soon have less time to take the test. According to the Airman Testing Community Advisory Committee, the publication of the FAA's Airman Testing Standards Branch, the decision to reduce the test time was made by the FAA and PSI Services LLC, the FAA's sole provider for FAA knowledge exams, after they performed what has been described as a scientific assessment of the knowledge test. Applicants taking the 60-question private pilot exam will have 120 minutes, down from 150, and applicants for the 100-question commercial pilot exam will have 150 minutes, down from 180. The change goes into effect April 24th, 2023. Also, there have been changes made to existing test questions on the private and commercial to assure that they are aligned with the ACS and reference an existing FAA handbook. It was noted that the testing supplements for both tests have not changed, nor has the price of the exams, which remains at $175. The third-party vendors, which operate the testing centers, have no say in the cost of the test or the amount of time the applicants have to perform the test. And separately, in a related story from flyingmag.com, recent changes in aviation knowledge testing availability and quality made by a third-party testing contractor are creating obstructions to FAA certification for pilots, according to a group of aviation stakeholders pressing the agency to increase oversight of the process. Since 2018, aviation knowledge tests have been administered by testing contractor PSI, following a competitive bid to become the sole provider of FAA knowledge exams. In January, the contractor introduced a new reimbursement structure which would reduce reimbursement rates for third-party providers, in some cases by more than 65% for most exams. According to a PSI official, the fee structure change was needed to improve security for aviation knowledge tests. Aviation stakeholders say that new reimbursement structure will negatively impact testing center availability and access to FAA knowledge exams because many third parties would stop providing the tests. From AOPA.org, en route IFR charts to have limited foreign information. Beginning with the June 15th charting cycle, limited foreign information will be charted on appropriate en route charts covering the U.S., Alaska, and the Pacific Ocean to help with situational awareness and transition planning. Charted information will be provided only for orientation and transitions to charts and publications of other countries, the FAA said. Pilots operating outside the U.S. should ensure that they have the pertinent country's aeronautical information publications, the FAA said. The agency said it doesn't get foreign data with enough lead time to produce the foreign areas of the charts with the same content as within U.S. airspace. And from avweb.com, this comes from their GA Accident Bulletin, and this is an NTSB preliminary report from December 2nd, 2022, of a Mooney M20J that crashed in Falmouth, Massachusetts at about 15:03 Eastern Time. The airplane was destroyed when it contacted terrain short of the intended runway. The private pilot was fatally injured. The commercial pilot in the right seat was seriously injured. Visual conditions prevailed. According to the NTSB, the commercial pilot, quote, was not the pilot in command, but was double-checking everything during the flight. On short final, she asked if the sun was in the flying pilot's eyes, and he said yes. She adjusted the sun visor, looked down for a GUMS check, and when she looked up, she knew they were going to hit the trees. She believed the pilot couldn't see because of the bright sunlight at the time of the approach. She stated that the engine was running fine, and they had no flight control anomalies at the time of the accident. And I will say that sometimes in situations like these, where there are lighting issues and it's hard to see the runway, it just makes sense to go around and land somewhere else. And I've done that on a couple different occasions when sunlight made it really difficult to see the runway. Also from avweb.com, Piper reopens for factory tours. After more than 2 years, Piper has officially resumed tours of their manufacturing facilities at their headquarters in Vero Beach, Florida. The company postponed public tours in 2020 due to the pandemic. Piper has been building aircraft at Vero Beach since the late 1950s and currently produces 9 models at the location. Ron Gunnarsson, Piper VP of Sales, Marketing, and Customer Support, said, "It's rare for a production facility like ours to open their doors to the public, but as one of the largest employers in Indian River County, we believe it's important for our community to see what we do here every day. With over 85 years of stellar manufacturing experience, we hope our community will take the opportunity to see what we offer not only locally, but to the aviation industry at large." Piper is offering factory tours on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10 and 1 p.m. local time. The visit, which can last about 2 hours, is complimentary and open to people ages 16 and older. According to Piper, the tours provide an in-depth look at their advanced production line, along with a stop at the on-site Piper pilot shop. And I visited the Piper factory many, many years ago, and it was definitely a very enjoyable tour, so I recommend you do that if you ever get a chance. From julieroys.com, U.S. missionary pilot and 2 others released from Mozambique prison. An American missionary pilot and 2 South Africans imprisoned for 4 months in war-torn Mozambique have been released, according to Mission Aviation Fellowship, or MAF. Ryan Coher and South Africans W.J. Duplessis and Eric Dry were arrested in November in southern Mozambique on suspicions they were supporting an Islamic insurgent group in the northern part of the country. But according to MAF, their case is ongoing and they are required to remain in Mozambique. David Holston, president of MAF, told media in December that it's not unusual for security officials to question pilots about their cargo, but in the past, pilots have been detained for only a few hours. Holston added that the missions group has historically had a good relationship with the government in Mozambique and is registered as a commercial airline, the same as any other airline. MAF has denied any wrongdoing on Coher's part. And from airlive.net, 2 pilots suspended for keeping beverage in the cockpit. Celebrating the Hindu holiday known as Holi irresponsibly while operating a flight has led to 2 SpiceJet pilots getting grounded. While having gujar yas, which is a type of food, on a domestic flight in India, the 2 had kept a cup of beverage over the flight deck's center console where even a little spillage could have affected safety. Once the picture of this celebration at 37,000 feet went viral, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation in India asked the airline to immediately identify the crew members and act against them. Complying with this directive, the airline a day later off-rostered the pilots. A senior pilot said the coffee cup has been put on the aircraft's fuel levers in the middle of the center console. Right below is the engine and APU's fire control switches. If the coffee spills and falls on the fire panel, it could trigger a short circuit, triggering a false fire warning. The crew will have to discharge fire bottles and declare an emergency. The cost to the company will be prohibitive. The center pedestal contains the main computer interface, important flight controls, engine control, and all communication systems. Quote, "This is not a place to keep anything. Liquids are a disaster here and can cause a short circuit and loss of control. The central pedestal is full of switches, all critical for a safe flight," said another captain. And finally, we have 2 helicopter shooting stories, which is amazing as we had another one just a few weeks ago. In the first from the NewYorkPost.com, Michigan men dead after pointing laser and opening fire at police helicopter. Michigan State Police shot and killed a man who pointed a laser and fired a rifle at a police helicopter. The incident happened around 8:30 p.m. when the helicopter circled north of downtown Detroit. The 33-year-old man, whose name was not released, had been staying in the abandoned home at the time of the shooting. 2 state troopers shot and killed the suspect, who recently moved into the home. In the video, the man emerged from the second-story window and pointed a green laser at the aircraft. "We've got someone hitting us with a green laser on the rear of the house upper window," the helicopter pilot said. Moments later, the man exited the house and aimed a long gun toward the hovering helicopter and opened fire. Police recovered 5 firearms at the abandoned house, including the one the suspect had used to fire on the aircraft. Also, separately from CBS8.com, man arrested for shooting at San Diego police helicopter, charged with attempted murder. A 49-year-old man was arrested and charged with multiple counts of attempted murder after shooting at a San Diego police helicopter in the Rolando neighborhood. Police received a call around 3:23 p.m. from an extremely upset man who told dispatchers his boat and vehicle were towed without warning. The suspect began cursing on the line with 911 and told dispatchers that he'd grab a gun and start shooting people, then hung up the phone. San Diego police launched a helicopter which arrived over the home where the 911 call originated from. As it circled overhead, the male grabbed a shotgun and fired a single shot in the direction of the helicopter. Fortunately, it appeared that he missed the helicopter. The man went back into his home but later came out and surrendered to officers. A shotgun and fired shotgun shells were later located in his yard. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And later we'll talk about some recent fatal night accidents that should have been avoidable. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's go to the good news department. First, congratulations to Richard Green of Ontario for passing his commercial. He says, "I'm Canadian, but most of the safety-related things you talk about are relevant regardless of where you fly. I just wanted to share that on February 24th, I achieved a lifetime dream of earning my commercial. I think I might be the oldest new commercial in Canada. I'll be 63 in May. Keep up your fine work on the podcast." Congratulations, Richard. And also congratulations to Michael Tett of Livermore, California. He says, "I recently passed my private. I discovered your podcast and wanted to say, keep up the great work. I always learn something new from each episode." Congratulations, Michael. And that is my goal, to have enough good information there that everyone's going to learn at least something new from each episode. And congratulations to Doug Fortney out in Ohio. He said, "Last month at 62 years of age, I earned my private. The learning experience was fantastic, and I recommend it to anyone my age who may hesitate because of their age. Just get your medical before you start and go for it. Your show has helped in many ways, but 2 in particular. I've done my training at Sky Park in Wadsworth, Ohio, but spend extensive time around the country on business, particularly in Cincinnati. After one of your shows, I looked up mega supporter Rick Miller, CFII at Lincoln Flight Training in Cincinnati. I told him that I'd heard about him through your show and asked if he would do some flight training with me. We've since become friends, and I highly recommend him to anyone in the Cincinnati area. The second way the show helped was episode 139, the private pilot mock check ride with Jason Blair. That episode was one of the keys to my preparation for the oral portion of the check ride. Everyone who's taking a private check ride should listen to episode 139 many times." Well, congratulations, Doug. And congratulations to Professor Daniel Langton in the UK, who won an aviation prize. He says, "My co-pilot Mark Atkinson and I recently won the Pooley's Microlight Trophy for the annual Dawn to Dusk International Prize. The award was made for plotting and flying precisely over each of the 214 peaks in the Lake District in one day. The ceremony took place at aviation's true mecca, the RAF Club in London, with Robin Keegan, master of the Honorable Company of Air Pilots, and Sebastian Pooley. One of the judges commented, "Twisting and turning over 214 peaks in a day in a microlight, rather you than me." That's great. So congratulations to you, Professor. And here's an email from patron supporter Mark Newton. He says, "I was just listening to the show and I had a thought about a near miss you talked about in Austin, Texas. The U.S. safety record is envied around the world. I'm especially enamored of the way GA accident and incident rates have spent the last decade trending downwards in the U.S. compared to Australia, where they're roughly the same for half a century. But a thing that blew me away when I first experienced it is the way the tower controllers in the FAA-administered airspace clear multiple aircraft onto runways at the same time. To expand on that, it's normal, though not universal, in the U.S. to receive tracking approach instructions and a landing clearance on first contact with a tower. And I'm going to interrupt here and say, I don't think so. Perhaps that's the case in less crowded airspace, but that is definitely not the norm here in Northern California to be cleared to land on your first contact with a tower. First contact is usually 10 miles away, and you're often not cleared until you're on downwind base, and in some cases, final. He continues, in the time that elapses between your receipt of a landing clearance and your actual touchdown, many other aircraft can be cleared to take off and land in front of you. In Australia, tower controllers behave very differently. They only clear one aircraft onto the runway at the same time. If they issued a landing clearance to someone, they won't clear anyone else to line up, take off, or cross the same runway. And if they've cleared a ground aircraft onto the runway, they won't clear anyone else to land until the runway is vacated. Essentially, one of the roles of the tower is to provide procedural separation assurance on the runway. If you're cleared, it belongs to you until you stop using it or your clearance is canceled. This difference in procedure has no impact on traffic flows. It just means I get my landing clearance when I'm on final approach instead of on initial contact. It also means the controllers take exclusive runway access into account when they're planning their traffic solutions. He says here, quote, I won't clear that citation to cross 29 right because I've already cleared that Citabria to land on it. The reason this has sprung to mind is because of the sequence of events leading up to the near miss in Austin, Texas. FedEx was cleared to land, then Southwest was cleared to take off in front of them. In my country, once FedEx has been cleared to land, Southwest would just have to wait at the hold short line until afterwards. Or, if Southwest was cleared to take off, FedEx would not be cleared to land and would have to take the missed approach. I like to think that maybe there's a lesson for the FAA in the wrap-up. It's insane and unfair to controllers that they're procedurally set up to clear an aircraft to enter a runway they can't see and collide with another airplane that they can't see. Maybe during reduced visibility ops, tower controllers could treat the runway environment as defended territory and only clear one airplane at a time. And here's what I wrote back to Mark, and I'm also going to play a recording here from 2 minutes of ATC communications at my local airport. I wrote to him, I said, I'm guessing the FAA permits this just to speed up the process and increase the number of planes that can land and take off. For example, the busiest airports like Chicago O'Hare probably would lose capacity and have to limit the number of flights if they didn't use this process. Interestingly, the FAA used to permit controllers to have an aircraft holding in position while another aircraft was cleared to land. After an accident at LAX where one airline landed on top of another aircraft that was holding in position on the runway, they banned that process. Now an aircraft can only hold in position if there are no airplanes cleared to land. While the FAA safety record is enviable, I do worry that we're going to have a major accident either on the ground or just above a runway. There just seem to be lots of close calls, even though I read a story recently that said the number of serious close calls has declined. Well, fingers crossed. And Mark replied, would it really reduce capacity, though? The only time it'd slow things down is if an aircraft on final had to initiate a go-around before touchdown because they didn't get cleared to land, and frankly, that's exactly the right answer. And I wrote back that, yes, I think the process you use in Australia would reduce the capacity at my home airport of Palo Alto, which does somewhere around 170,000 operations per year with a single runway. After one aircraft lands and is still on the runway, the tower will have someone line up and wait on the runway. As soon as the landed aircraft is off the runway, the aircraft in position is cleared for takeoff. It's not unusual to hear someone cleared number 6 to land, and I often see 3 to 5 aircraft on the ground lined up waiting to take off. I'm guessing it takes the typical aircraft 20 seconds to get onto the runway, so the process probably saves that much time, and over the course of a busy day, that process must increase the capacity a little. Now here's a recording from last week when I was in the traffic pattern at Palo Alto. It runs just a little over 2 minutes, and I just want to emphasize I have not cut out any of the spaces to compress this recording. What you hear is what actually occurred in real time. You're going to hear multiple lineup and waits, and you're going to hear a lot of people clear to land. So admittedly, it's not this busy all the time, but I want you to hear what it's like when things do get busy at my airport.
5 Charlie Mike, your traffic to follow is just south of the amphitheater now, 1,100.
Copy, looking for the traffic, 5 Charlie Mike.
Thank you. There's a 4 Sierra Papa runway 31, line up and away, traffic, a 3-mile final, Cardinal.
Line up and away, 31, 4 Sierra Papa.
The 6 Charlie Sierra, left turn on Charlie, runway 31, taxi back via leave time, via termination.
Left turn on Charlie, I'd like to go back to West Valley Park.
Contact ground.
To ground, see you.
here, 7 Juliet Whiskey, pull up to hold short, runway 31, your number 3.
Number 3, hold short, runway 31, 7 Juliet Whiskey.
Cardinal 7 Delta Mike, runway 31, continue traffic, holding in position.
3-1, continue, 7 Delta Mike.
That's 4 Sierra Papa, left unbarred departure, runway 31, clear for takeoff, no delay.
Clear for takeoff, runway 31, 74 Sierra Papa.
That's the 2 Echo Lima, runway 31, line up and wait, traffic 2 mile final, Cardinal.
Line up and wait, runway 31, Echo Lima. Traffic inside, 5 Charlie Mike.
It's a 5 Charlie Mike, your traffic to follow is turning left base now, weighing up, just to confirm that's your traffic.
Okay, we had the traffic on final, looking for the left base traffic to follow 5 Charlie Mike.
Affirmative, sir, they're about 2 miles ahead of you, turn to left base over the amphitheater now.
We have the traffic in sight, 5 Charlie Mike.
Thank you. That's a 2 Echo Lima, right Dunbar departure, runway 31, clear for takeoff, keep up with Cessna off your left.
Right, clear for takeoff, runway 31, keep the light on the Cessna, 2 Echo Lima.
2 Echo Lima, runway 31, clear for takeoff.
Clear for takeoff, 2 Echo Lima.
Cardinal 7 Delta Mike, number 1, runway 31, clear to land.
Number 1, 3-1, clear to land, 7 Delta Mike.
That's a 8-4 Sierra, number 2, runway 31, clear to land.
Number 2, 3-1, clear to land, 8-4 Sierra.
Sorry, 5 Charlie Mike, number 3, follow the Cessna off your right wing, runway 31, clear to land.
Clear to land, runway 31, traffic inside, 5 Charlie Mike.
That's 8-4 Zulu, number 4, runway 31, clear for the option, if on the go, make right, close traffic.
Number 4, 3-1, clear for the option on the go, right, check close traffic, 8-4 Zulu.
That's a 8-4 Sierra, you can start your left crosswind turn for faster traffic and trail.
We'll sail well on there, final.
646, frequency change approved.
Good day, 646.
Well, I'm sure you can see that flying out of Palo Alto is not for the faint of heart. The first time I flew there, I had already been a private pilot for 8 years, and that place scared me to death. So it took a while to get familiar with the operations there and be able to keep up with the rapid pace. And just to close out thoughts on Mark's comments, there are indeed times when I do get cleared to land immediately. Usually that's in the evening when there's not much traffic. I'm always surprised when I'm 10 miles out and get clear to land on the first call, because that really is very rare at my particular airport. And here's an email from patron supporter Greg Zurcher. He says, "Hi, Max. I'm a 50-year-old, 350-hour private pilot and Cessna 182 owner based at Centennial Airport, and I'm currently training for my instrument rating. I've been listening to your podcast for the past year and find them immensely helpful. I can't imagine the amount of work and time that you put into this podcast, and I'm happy to join now at the $20 a month level. You probably aren't getting rich off of this, but you are not only making me a better pilot, but everyone else who listens to the show. I truly feel like you save lives and want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, Greg." Hey, thanks so much. That's very kind of you. I greatly appreciate that. And aviation is a very small community, so take a listen and see if you recognize the names of any of these listeners who took the time during the past 2 weeks to sign up as a member to join the show and support the club. They include 2 new mega supporters. These are folks at the $50 a month level, Hunter Clark and Peter F. White, and I'll tell you more about them on a future show. Other people who've signed up at the $20 a month level include Matthew Reed, Jack Singer, Darren, Jason Sims, Chris Ostrowski edited up to $20 a month, Daniel Donovan, Greg Zurcher, and KJ. And we also had Valerie Milner sign up at the $8 a month level, and Scott Sumner signed up at the $35 a month level. Thank you so very much for joining the show. And we also had a PayPal supporter join us, and that's Randolph Lasota. So if you'd like to support the show, it's easy to do. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And you can sign up at any of the dollar levels shown there. Or if you'd like to make a one-time donation, go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Coming up next, we're going to be talking about some night accidents, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about a couple of recent night accidents. The first one we'll talk about occurred on March 5th at the Palm Beach County Park Airport in Lantana, Florida. And it fits a pattern that I noticed years ago as I was creating a presentation on how to buy a new airplane. Now, while researching that presentation, I discovered that there are many accidents that occur to buyers of new and used aircraft. Many of these accidents happen on the trip home in the newly purchased aircraft, and a significant number of accidents also occur within the first few days or weeks after the purchase. There were several major factors in these buying an aircraft accidents. Some of them involve pilots or the CFIs they brought along with them, who had very low time in the type of aircraft purchased. In general, pilots tend to have fewer accidents after they've accumulated more than 100 hours in a particular type of aircraft. So if you're buying an airplane and you're bringing someone along to help you, it's not their total time that matters the most. What matters is that they have at least 100 hours in the aircraft type that you're buying. Many of the buying an aircraft accidents involved long flights across the country, which undoubtedly led to fatigue. Most of them happened on a weekend, as presumably the pilots were trying to get home before they had to get to work on Monday, and many of them involved weather. In this particular case, the accident occurred on a Sunday night at the end of 9.5 hours of flying to bring a used aircraft from Kentucky to the new home base near Palm Beach, Florida. The aircraft was a 2003 Diamond DA-40, November 804ER. 2003 was the last year that Diamond sold these aircraft with round gauges, and indeed this aircraft was one of the last round gauge aircraft produced. I've always felt that glass cockpit aircraft are inherently safer because of the many additional safety features they have, though in this case I don't think the type of instrumentation was much of a factor in this accident. One big advantage of glass cockpit aircraft is that the horizon line is 10 inches wide, which makes it very easy to see if the aircraft is banked a few degrees to the left or right. By contrast, in round gauge aircraft, the miniature airplane in the artificial horizon is just 2 inches wide, and it's far less noticeable when the aircraft is in an inadvertent bank to the left or right. The NTSB has yet to issue a preliminary report of this accident. In fact, they have not even listed the crash on their website more than 2 weeks after the crash, which is a little unusual. But based upon news reports and ADSB data, there's a fairly clear picture of what happened. FlightAware.com shows that the accident aircraft first took to the skies on Sunday morning at 10:49 a.m. Central Time in Henderson, Kentucky, made one loop around the pattern, and landed. The aircraft was noticeably fast. As it was descending on the downwind, it was still at 117 knots as it started to turn base. After turning final, it was still doing 100 knots. I've flown these older DA-40s, and I recall the landing speed was 71 knots. In later models, it was 73 knots, and in the newer DA-40NG, it's even faster. For these older aircraft, I would typically fly them about 90 knots on downwind, 80 knots on base, and 71 knots on final. So this first landing suggests to me that the pilots flew the approach fast, perhaps because they were either a little distracted or maybe they didn't have a lot of recent time in DA-40s. 4 minutes after landing, the aircraft departed on the first leg of the trip. It was now about 11 a.m. Central Time and noon at their destination in Florida. Their first destination was Pine Mountain, Georgia, KPIM. Total flight time was about 2 hours and 40 minutes. Then they were on the ground for an hour and 50 minutes before taking off again. Now that's a surprisingly long time for a fuel stop. My guess is that since they landed at about 2:40 p.m. Eastern Time, they were perhaps hungry and spent a lot of time looking for food. I've made dozens of trips across the country in small aircraft, and as I've mentioned before, I almost always buy my lunch the night before and bring it with me in the airplane. I've been surprised at how long it takes to find food when you stop at a typical GA airport. And when you're trying to move a plane a long distance across the country, getting started an hour later than planned or taking an extra hour to find food really adds up over the course of the day, lengthens your duty day, and that often leads to greater fatigue and the need to make a night landing. The aircraft departed Pine Mountain at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time and flew for 2 hours and 10 minutes, landing at Williston Muni in Williston, Florida. That's X-ray 60 at 6:40 p.m. They spent less than 45 minutes on the ground, which is pretty good for a fuel stop, and they were back in the air at 7:23 p.m., headed for their destination of Palm Beach County Park Airport in Lantana, Florida. They flew for 2 hours and 1 minute and made a very long straight-in approach to runway 10. Lantana is a non-towered airport just south of Palm Beach International Airport, and it's located under PBI's Class C. It's a busy, non-towered airport with 3 runways that are configured in a triangle. All of the runways are a little over 3,000 feet long. Runway 10 is the longest at 3,489 feet, though it's just 75 feet wide. I'm familiar with Lantana as my in-laws, when they were alive, lived close by, and I rented aircraft there several times, including taking my very first helicopter lesson in a Robinson R22 at Palm Beach Helicopters nearly 20 years ago. The weather, which was reported 9 minutes before the accident, was reported as 110 at 3 knots, so virtually straight down the runway, 10-mile visibility, and the sky was clear below 12,000 feet. At 2.6 miles from the runway, they were at 900 feet, which is about the right height for a 3-degree approach, so they appeared to have been on the glide slope. However, at this point, they were still fairly fast at 113 knots, or 40 knots faster than the landing speed for this aircraft. Also, they were still above the flap extension speeds. For this model, you have to be at 108 knots or less to put in the first notch of flaps, which Diamond calls takeoff flaps, and below 91 knots to put in the second, which is the last notch of flaps, which Diamond calls the landing flaps position. However, they slowed up quickly. At 2 miles, they were at 89 knots ground speed. They maintained that speed for the next mile and finally slowed to 76 knots, just short of the runway threshold. Assuming they had the 3-knot headwind that was reported, their true airspeed was 79 knots as they approached the numbers, or 8 knots over the recommended landing speed. From the data, it appears that the aircraft touched down just past the numbers at a ground speed of around 71 knots, which would be about 74 knots airspeed. It's possible that the aircraft never touched down and just did a low approach, but most likely the aircraft did touch down, however, briefly. The next data point, about a third of the way down the runway and 5 seconds later, shows them back in the air at 66 knots, which is the VY climb speed for this aircraft at max gross weight. But something is clearly wrong at this point. As the aircraft continues, it gains just 100 feet as it overflies the remaining 2/3 of the runway, and the airspeed slowly decreases. At the end of the runway, it's at approximately 150 feet AGL. The aircraft then begins a turn to the right and completes a 180-degree turn in just 18 seconds, while only gaining an additional 25 feet. It's now beamed the 28 numbers on a downwind heading, but because of the slow speed in the turn, it's now slightly less than 0.2 nautical miles from the 28 numbers after completing the turn. The average speed throughout the turn was about 63 knots, so using a bank angle calculator, I was able to calculate that the average bank angle in the turn was around 32 degrees. Now that surprised me, as based on prior accidents, I expected the turn was much steeper than that and the aircraft was out of control. But what this tells us is that the two pilots were very much in control of the airplane during the turn, but they were very slow and barely able to get the aircraft to climb. Soon after completing the turn, the aircraft appears to have gone almost straight down with an increase in airspeed to 76 knots. Now I can only imagine how anxious these two pilots were to find themselves in an aircraft that could barely climb at night, just moments after they thought they were about to have a successful landing. So that raises the question, what happened to this aircraft when it landed that rendered it unable to climb at a normal rate? Now, there are a number of possibilities. Let's talk first about the less likely causes, and then about the two most likely causes of the aircraft's poor climb rate. It's possible that moments after the aircraft touched down and started to go around, that the engine suddenly lost partial power. That would certainly explain why the aircraft was climbing so slowly. However, I think the odds of the engine suddenly losing its ability to develop full power moments after it apparently began to go around are just astronomical. Yes, the pilots could have had incredibly bad luck and lost engine power at this exact moment that they needed it, but based on my observations of many botched go-arounds, there are some more likely explanations. It's also possible that the pilots forgot to do the pre-landing checklist and failed to advance the prop control and the mixture control fully forward prior to landing. Certainly an aircraft can land that way, and depending upon how aggressively the mixture was leaned in cruise, it might have trouble developing enough power to climb. Again, while this is one possibility, I think the probability of this is low. When I've been in a situation where pilots have forgotten to enrich in the mixture before applying full power, the engine coughs badly, and it's clear that the engine is not getting enough fuel or enough air. Since the problem is rarely the air, most pilots I've observed in this situation have quickly deduced that the fuel flow is insufficient, and they have quickly enriched in the mixture. From the time the aircraft apparently touched down until the time it crashed, about 45 seconds elapsed. If the engine were coughing badly, I think it's unlikely not just one but two pilots would both overlook that the mixture control wasn't fully forward. Of course, these two pilots had been flying all day and were certainly fatigued, so while they might have quickly caught a problem like this under normal circumstances, it's possible that due to fatigue, they did overlook an out-of-position mixture control, so we can't totally discount that possibility. Now we come to the two most likely causes. Based on the data, it's highly likely that when the aircraft touched down, there was something bad about the landing and the pilots decided to go around. The most likely reason to go around would be a bounced landing. Bounces often occur when an aircraft either touches down flat or it flares too high, and then drops down after it gets slow. The pilots flew a very fast approach earlier in the day and might have been a little fast on this landing, increasing the odds of a flat landing, leading to a bounce. Also at night, pilots tend to flare a little too high, as they often use the runway lights, which stick up about a foot above the runway, as a proxy for the runway. When pilots flare too high, that increases the odds that they will get slow and drop down quickly to the runway, which can lead to a bounce. Regardless, something caused these pilots to do a go-around, and it was most likely a bad landing. Often when I see pilots do a go-around, they forget to raise the flaps. And when this occurs, an aircraft has trouble climbing. Could they have flown a full 45 seconds without realizing that they had forgotten to raise the flaps? Absolutely. I once took a couple of minutes to recognize that I'd forgotten to raise the landing gear, and that occurred just last year, not when I was a younger, less experienced pilot. I have several hundred hours and 4 different variations of the Diamond DA40, including this version, but I've never tried climbing at full flaps, so I don't know what the climb performance would be like in that configuration, but I wouldn't expect it to be very good. Also, there's something that happened at the end of the flight that points toward the flaps as being the culprit. You may recall hearing about the fatal accident of a Cirrus SR20 a few years ago at one of the Houston airports. That pilot faced a challenging set of tower instructions that led to at least 3 go-arounds and multiple runway changes as the controllers tried to fit that aircraft in between a series of faster aircraft and airliners. On the last go-around, the pilot's climb speed was slower than usual and was in the 60s as I recall. That's much too slow for an aircraft with a stall speed just under 60 knots in a landing configuration. Sadly, when the pilot raised the flaps on that go-around, the aircraft stalled and crashed immediately as it was flying at too slow a speed for the new flaps-up configuration, which has a significantly higher stall speed. The pilot, in essence, shot herself down by raising the flaps at such a low speed. Looking at the ADS-B data for the DA40 accident at Lantana, it's entirely possible that these pilots also shot themselves down by finally recognizing that the flaps were down and then raising them all the way up when the aircraft was too slow to sustain flight in the new configuration at that slow an airspeed. Anytime you have to do a go-around, flaps should be raised incrementally, not all at once. Yet I often see pilots forget to raise flaps incrementally after a go-around or a stall recovery. Usually it's after they've forgotten to raise the flaps for some time, and then in their haste to rectify the situation, they raise the flaps completely up in one foul swoop. And I think that is the most likely explanation for this crash. But another possibility is that the aircraft had a prop strike and bounced when it landed. Having a bent prop would reduce the climb performance of the aircraft, and in extreme cases would make it very difficult to climb. It could also result in significant vibrations to the aircraft. A pilot who I've flown with once or twice had a prop strike at night at my home airport in his Cirrus SR20, and he noticed that he had a decreased climb rate during the go-around. As I recall, he didn't realize that he'd struck the prop until after he got around the pattern, landed, and shut down the aircraft. So depending upon the severity of a possible prop strike, that could explain the poor climb performance of the accident aircraft. Though it doesn't explain why, after the aircraft completed the turn, that it suddenly crashed. It's certainly possible that the performance suddenly got worse, perhaps because the aircraft lost a propeller blade, which would have led to extreme vibration in the aircraft. If the aircraft did lose a prop blade, we'll learn about that from an NTSB report. So, regardless of what happened, a key takeaway for all of us is that pilots need to periodically practice go-arounds, as it's easy to make mistakes during this procedure, especially with the flap retraction. Some number of years ago, I realized that I was spending more time teaching pilots how to save botched landings and less time practicing go-arounds. So I changed my teaching and began placing even more emphasis on go-arounds and less emphasis on trying to fix every landing. And a key reason it's important to practice go-arounds and avoid accidents such as this one is the high personal cost that comes as a result of fatal accidents. Here's what the Palm Beach Post said about the CFI on board the aircraft and about his surviving wife. The article says that the couple married at a small ceremony at the Delray Beach Courthouse last month and had planned to have a large wedding ceremony after the expected birth of their first child, a baby girl, in April. His wife described her husband's death just weeks after their wedding and before their daughter's birth as heartbreaking. Quote, "It has just been a huge and devastating loss for everybody," she said of her husband, who worked as a flight safety instructor in addition to flying for private charter companies. Quote, "Every time you saw him, he had a smile on his face," she said. "All of his students loved him. He was so intelligent, it just made you feel like family when you met him. It's just a huge loss not only for me, but for everybody." She described her husband as an experienced pilot who had more than 700 hours flying single-engine planes. He worked for a Palm Beach County-based company and had traveled to Kentucky to pick up a new plane recently purchased by the company, she said. After learning the news, she thought about the couple's yet-to-be-born daughter. She's now going to grow up without a father, she said. Her husband had served for 5 years in the U.S. Army, where he flew helicopters and did 2 tours in Afghanistan. He worked in commercial real estate upon retiring from the Army, but later decided to pursue his commercial pilot's license. Quote, "He was following his passion to eventually become an airline pilot and take care of his family," she said. He was 43 years old. Also in the crash was a 34-year-old man, a private pilot who was working on his commercial certificate with the CFI on board. His father said that he was a selfless, loving son who had a passion for flying. So this was a very tragic loss, and quite possibly it was avoidable. Now, the second accident occurred at night on December 3rd, 2022 at the Venice, Florida airport. According to the preliminary NTSB report, the Piper PA-28-151, November 4676 Foxtrot, lifted from the runway at 7:37 p.m. and 44 seconds at 88 knots. After liftoff over the remaining 900 feet of runway, the airplane accelerated to 90 knots and climbed to about 50 feet. Over the next 4 seconds, there were 2 data points, both at an altitude of 75 feet and ground speeds of 91 knots and 94 knots. At 7:38, just 16 seconds after takeoff, the final data point showed the plane at 0 elevation and 109 knots ground speed. It was now about 1,800 feet beyond the departure end of runway 23 over the Gulf of Mexico. Dark night conditions prevailed around Venice at the time of the accident. The reported weather included winds from 070 at 7 knots, a broken ceiling at 5,000 feet, and 7 statute miles visibility. Airport surveillance video from the time of the accident depicted an airplane departing runway 23 with little to no angle of climb into a dark sky over dark water with no discernible horizon. An FAA aviation safety inspector reviewed the pilot's rental and instruction record, which revealed that the pilot had accrued 74.2 total hours of flight experience, of which 67.6 were in the accident airplane make and model. The pilot obtained his private pilot certificate on July 31st, 2022, and he had accrued 13.5 hours of flight experience since that date. So this was a very low-time private pilot who probably had no idea about the dangers he faced by taking off over water on a dark night. And this type of takeoff has killed pilots with far more experience than he had. In fact, the same type of takeoff at night from Key West, Florida, killed a couple who were best friends of one of my coworkers at HP years ago. Just like this accident, the aircraft took off at night over dark water and crashed almost immediately after takeoff. Now, how does this happen? Longtime listeners of the show hopefully remember episode 157 back in 2020, which was called 5 Ways Cinematographic Illusion is Killing Pilots. Here's what I wrote for the show description. Max talks about 5 ways cinematographic illusion continues to kill pilots, including private, instrument, commercial, airline, and even glider pilots. It's particularly dangerous when taking off at night over a poorly lit surface, when doing instrument takeoffs in 0 visibility, and when an instrument pilot begins the missed approach. There's evidence it also affects glider pilots after cable breaks. Now, for many years I gave presentations at AirVenture on night flying safety, and in it I talked about cinematographic illusion. What I said in the episode was, what happens in these situations is that as the aircraft accelerates during takeoff, cinematographic illusion causes pilots to perceive their heads as tilting backwards, and pilots will perceive that they're in a climb. Since they will perceive that they're climbing, they won't pull back on the yoke enough to actually climb. Instead, they're often flying straight and level, or may actually be pushing forward on the yoke to give them a small descent. This is never a problem in the daytime, as even though pilots experience the same sensations, the view of houses and trees below gives them the correct sense of how close they are to the ground, so that they will pull back on the yoke correctly. But at night, when flying over a dark and poorly lit area, pilots don't get any visual feedback and won't be aware that they're flying level instead of climbing. The solution to this problem is very simple. When taking off at night, pilots must look at their instruments, immediately after rotation and verify that they are climbing at VY, the best rate of climb speed for their aircraft, and that the vertical speed indicator is showing a positive rate of climb. Pilots have to resist the temptation to push forward on the yoke when their senses, specifically one of the utricules in their ear, is telling them incorrectly that they are in a climb. And I'm guessing that most pilots have never heard of somatographic illusion, which is why it continues to kill pilots every year. And most of these crashes occur within 1 mile of an airport. So just remember that your senses lie to you, and that when taking off in dark night conditions, you have to rely on your instruments. Otherwise, you can be dead before you know it. And coming up later in the week, look for another listener mailbag episode. We'll be reading many of your emails. If you haven't sent one in and you've got a comment, a thought, a question, it's easy to send an email. Just go out to our website, aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page, and that's the absolute best way to send me an email about anything. Or if you'd like to record up to 90 seconds with your question, listeners love to hear your voice. Go to that same website, aviationnewstalk.com, and click on Listener Question at the top of the page, which will take you to our SpeakPipe app where you can record a question. And if I could ask for your help on just one thing, please pick one friend that you'd like to share this episode with. And there's a share button on whatever app that you're using. Go ahead and share this episode now with one of your friends. And afterwards, encourage them to subscribe to the show and become a member, because that is the single biggest way that we find new listeners for the show. Thanks so much for your help. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember, you can always go around.
You